"Don't start drama," my daughter-in-law said, looking me straight in the eyes as I stood there holding a casserole dish with trembling hands. 3 words that shattered what was left of my 71-year-old heart. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I'd share. And if you, for even a second, feel like this sounds familiar, just please leave a like and subscribe. It'll help me keep sharing these truths that so many of us carry in silence. My name is Margaret. I live in a quiet neighborhood in Portland, Oregon, where the rain taps against windows like whispered secrets, and the old oak trees have watched generations of families grow and fracture. At 71, I thought I knew what my life looked like. I thought I understood my place in this world, my role in my family. I was the foundation, the reliable one, the woman who held everything together with calloused hands and an endless supply of forgiveness. That Sunday had started like so many others over the past 7 years. I woke up at 6 a.m., even though my arthritis screamed in protest as I shuffled to the kitchen. The house felt too big around me, too quiet, too full of memories that seemed to mock me from every corner. I pulled on my favorite cardigan, the blue one with tiny pearl buttons that my late husband James had bought me for our 40th anniversary, and began preparing what I hoped would be a perfect family dinner. Roast chicken with rosemary and thyme, garlic mashed potatoes whipped until they were cloud-soft, green beans with slivered almonds, and an apple pie cooling on the windowsill. The same meal I used to make when Kyle was small, when he'd sneak into the kitchen for early tastes, his little fingers sticky with mashed potatoes, saying, "Mom, you're the best cook in the whole world." I set the dining room table with my grandmother's china, the delicate plates with tiny blue roses that had survived the Depression, 2 moves, and decades of Sunday dinners. I folded the cloth napkins just so, arranged fresh flowers from my garden in the center, and even lit the good candles. Everything had to be perfect. It always had to be perfect, because maybe this time they'd stay longer than 20 minutes. Maybe this time my son would look me in the eyes when he spoke to me. Kyle arrived first, his BMW pulling into the driveway with that soft purr of expensive machinery. He's 45 now, successful in his tech consulting business, always wearing those pressed shirts and polished shoes that make him look like a stranger wearing my little boy's face. He kissed my cheek without really looking at me, the way you might greet a distant relative at a funeral. Obligatory, quick, already thinking about being somewhere else. "Hey, Mom," he said, his voice flat and distracted as he immediately pulled out his phone. "Smells good in here." But he didn't mean it. I could tell because he didn't inhale deeply the way he used to, didn't close his eyes for just a moment to savor the familiar sense of home. He just said the words because they were expected, because they filled the uncomfortable silence that had grown between us like a cancer over the years. Melissa followed 10 minutes later, her heels clicking against my hardwood floors like gunshots in a cathedral. She's beautiful in that sharp, calculated way. Blonde hair always perfectly styled, makeup that never smudges, clothes that cost more than my monthly pension. She handed me a bottle of wine, cheap stuff from the grocery store, and said flatly, "We won't stay long. The kids have homework." The kids. My grandchildren. Emma, 12, and Ben, 15. They rushed past me without so much as a hello, heading straight for the living room where they immediately disappeared into their phones and tablets. No hugs, no excited chatter about school or friends or the little things that used to make their eyes light up. Just the sound of electronic beeping and the glow of screens reflecting off their young faces. I stood there in my own home, wearing the new sweater I'd bought with the last of my grocery money, feeling like a stranger in my own life. The pie I'd spent 3 hours making sat ignored on the counter. The flowers I'd carefully arranged seemed to wilt under the weight of their indifference. "Dinner's ready," I announced softly, my voice barely carrying over the sound of their devices. They came to the table like it was a chore, like I was a waitress they were obligated to acknowledge. Kyle checked his email while eating. Melissa scrolled through social media, occasionally showing Kyle something on her screen while completely ignoring my attempts at conversation. Emma picked at her food and sighed dramatically when I asked about her algebra class. Ben grunted one-word answers when I inquired about his basketball team. I felt invisible. Worse than invisible, I felt like a burden they were enduring out of some outdated sense of duty. And then I made the mistake of bringing up the mortgage. "I need to talk to you about something," I said quietly, my heart already racing because I knew how this conversation would go. I haven't been able to make the full payment this month. My medical expenses have been— Margaret, Melissa interrupted, not even looking up from her phone. Don't start drama. Those 3 words hit me like a physical blow. Don't start drama. As if my financial struggle was mere drama. As if the fact that I'd been bleeding my pension dry to keep their house, the house I'd put in my name because their credit was destroyed, was some kind of performance for attention. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur of mechanical chewing and forced politeness. They left 10 minutes after finishing their plates, taking not a single leftover, offering not a word of gratitude or concern. No hug goodbye. No thank you for dinner, Mom. No, we love you. Just the sound of car doors slamming and engines starting, leaving me alone with dirty dishes and the echo of Melissa's words ringing in my ears. That night, I sat in James's old recliner, the one piece of furniture I'd refused to let them replace when they moved in, and I cried. Not the polite, quiet tears of a dignified elderly woman, but the ugly, gut-wrenching sobs of someone whose heart was finally breaking after years of slow, steady cracking. I cried for the grandmother I'd become, forgotten except when needed, invisible except when convenient. I cried for the thousands of dollars I'd spent on school clothes and medical bills and birthday presents that were opened with obligatory smiles and quickly forgotten. I cried for every holiday I'd spent alone, every phone call that went unanswered, every Sunday dinner where I felt like an intruder in my own home. And as I sat there in the darkness, surrounded by the ghosts of better times, I began to remember exactly how I'd ended up here. Exactly how I'd become the family ATM who wasn't even allowed to express concern about overdraft fees without being accused of causing drama. The memory was sharp and painful, like pressing on a bruise that had never quite healed. It was 7 years ago when Kyle first came to me with that desperate look in his eyes. The same expression he'd worn as a child when he'd broken something precious and needed his mother to fix it. James had been gone for 3 years by then, and I was still learning how to live in a world that felt too quiet, too empty, too vast for one person to fill. "Mom, we need your help," Kyle had said, sitting across from me at this very kitchen table. Melissa stood behind him, her manicured fingers resting on his shoulders like she was claiming territory. "Our credit is shot. The business loan we took out for the consulting firm. We defaulted when that big client pulled out. We can't get approved for a mortgage." I remember how my heart ached for them. Kyle looked so defeated, so much like the little boy who used to come to me when the world felt too big and scary. Melissa was pregnant with Emma then, her belly round and promising, and I imagined my grandchild growing up without a stable home. "We found this perfect house," Melissa had said, pulling out photos on her phone. 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, a big backyard for the kids. "But we need someone with good credit to co-sign." Actually, she'd glanced at Kyle, and something passed between them that I didn't understand then. "We need someone to put it in their name entirely, just temporarily, until we can rebuild our credit." The house was beautiful, a 2-story colonial in one of Portland's nicer neighborhoods, with mature maple trees and a wraparound porch that reminded me of the home I'd grown up in. The asking price made my chest tight. $485,000. More money than I'd ever imagined spending on anything. "I don't know if I can afford something like that," I'd said carefully. "My pension is comfortable, but not for a mortgage that size." "Mom," Kyle had said, reaching across the table to take my hands, "we'll make the payments. Every single one. You'd just be helping us get approved. We'll cover everything. Mortgage, insurance, property taxes, maintenance. You won't pay a dime." The way he said it, with such certainty, such gratitude in his voice, made me want to believe him, made me want to be the mother who could solve her son's problems, who could provide the security for my grandchildren that I'd fought so hard to give Kyle after his father died too young. "You'd be saving our family," Melissa had added, her hand moving protectively over her belly. "We can't raise children in that tiny apartment much longer, and Kyle's business is already picking up again. We'll have this paid off in 5 years, maybe less." So I did it. I cashed in the life insurance policy James had left me, $150,000 that was supposed to be my security blanket, my insurance against ending up in some state-run nursing home. I sold James's restored '67 Mustang, The car he'd spent 10 years lovingly rebuilding in our garage. The car I'd planned to pass down to Kyle someday. Another $35,000 gone in a single afternoon. I remember sitting in the bank office, signing document after document, my hand shaking as I put my name on papers that transferred more money than I'd ever seen at once. The loan officer, a kind woman named Patricia, had looked concerned. "Mrs. Morrison, are you sure about this? This is a significant financial commitment for someone on a fixed income. Have you considered what would happen if your son couldn't make the payments?" I'd assured her that Kyle was responsible, that he'd never let me down, that this was what family did for each other. I was so naive. The first year went exactly as promised. Kyle and Melissa moved into their dream house, and I was invited for dinner every Sunday. I'd sit at their elegant dining room table, watching Emma take her first steps across their hardwood floors, feeling useful and needed and loved. They'd show me around the house like proud children, pointing out the renovations they were planning, the garden Melissa wanted to plant, the nursery they were preparing for Ben. "Mom, we can never thank you enough for this," Kyle would say, and I'd feel warm all over, justified in my sacrifice. But by the second year, things started to change. The Sunday dinners became less frequent. "We're just so busy with the kids and work," Melissa would explain when I called. "Maybe next week." Next week would become next month, which would become when things settle down. I started visiting unannounced, bringing meals I'd cooked, hoping to spend time with my grandchildren. But Melissa would answer the door with that tight smile of hers, accepting the food but not inviting me in. "The kids are napping," she'd say. Or, "We were just about to leave for soccer practice." By the third year, I noticed the changes they were making to the house. My family photos, pictures of Kyle as a baby, photos of James and me at our wedding, snapshots of 3 generations gathered around Christmas trees, had been replaced with modern art and professional family portraits that didn't include me. The guest room where I used to stay overnight when babysitting became Melissa's home office. My key to the house stopped working after they upgraded the security system. The mortgage payments, which had been automatic from their account for the first 18 months, started coming late. Then they stopped coming from their account altogether. "Mom, there's been a mix-up with the bank," Kyle explained when I called about the notice I'd received. "Can you just cover it this month? We'll pay you back plus interest." 1 month became 3. 3 became 6. By the 4th year, I was making the entire mortgage payment myself, plus the property taxes, plus the homeowner's insurance. $3,200 a month coming out of my $2,800 pension, forcing me to dip into what remained of my savings just to buy groceries and pay for my prescription medications. "It's just temporary," Kyle kept saying. "The business is going through a rough patch, but we're about to land this huge contract. Everything will be back to normal soon." Normal. I began to wonder what that word even meant anymore. When I tried to discuss the financial strain, Melissa would get that pinched look around her eyes. "Margaret, we're already stressed enough about money without you adding to it. Can't you just trust that we're doing our best?" Trust. That word became a weapon they used against me whenever I expressed concern. Trust that they were trying. Trust that they cared. Trust that they weren't taking advantage of the woman who'd given them everything. I trusted when they needed me to babysit so they could take weekend trips to wine country. I trusted when they needed me to pay for Emma's private dance lessons because it's so important for her confidence. I trusted when they needed me to cover Ben's expensive baseball camp because all his friends are going. I trusted when they stopped inviting me to family gatherings but still expected me to provide the money that made their lifestyle possible. The worst part wasn't the money, though. It was watching myself disappear from their lives while still being expected to fund them. Christmas mornings where I'd drop off carefully chosen presents and find Melissa's parents already there, drinking coffee and watching the kids open gifts in my living room. The living room I was paying for but no longer welcome to use. "We just thought you'd be more comfortable having a quiet morning," Kyle would say when I asked why I wasn't included. "You know how overwhelming big crowds can be for someone your age." Someone my age. As if 71 made me fragile and inconvenient rather than experienced and wise. I started having conversations with myself in the empty house that had once been mine, walking through rooms that had been redecorated without my input, looking at family photos that no longer included my face. Was I used? I'd whisper to James's picture on my nightstand. Am I just an ATM they visit when they need a withdrawal? The answer was becoming clearer every day, but I wasn't ready to face it yet. Because facing it would mean admitting that the son I'd raised to be honorable and grateful had become someone I no longer recognized. Someone who could take everything I had to give and still somehow make me feel guilty for giving it. The breaking point was building inside me like pressure in a kettle, and I didn't even realize how close I was to boiling over until that Sunday dinner when 3 simple words finally showed me the truth about what I'd become in their eyes. Not a mother, not a grandmother, just an inconvenience who occasionally needed to be managed when she got too bold about expressing her own needs. The morning after that devastating Sunday dinner, I woke up with Melissa's words still echoing in my head like a broken record. Don't start drama. I lay in my narrow bed, the guest bed in what used to be my own master bedroom, staring at the ceiling and trying to understand when expressing financial concern had become drama in my own family. My 72nd birthday was 3 weeks later. I didn't expect a party. I'd learned not to expect those kinds of things anymore. But I thought maybe Kyle would call. Maybe the grandchildren would remember. I'd dropped enough hints over the past month, circling the date on the kitchen calendar, mentioning how quiet birthdays had become since James passed. The day came and went like any other. I sat by the phone from morning until night, jumping every time it rang, only to hear telemarketers and robocalls. I'd baked myself a small chocolate cake, James's favorite recipe, and eaten a slice while looking at old photo albums. Pictures of birthday parties from when Kyle was young, when I was the center of celebrations instead of an afterthought. At 9 p.m., my phone finally buzzed with a text message from Kyle. Happy birthday, Mom. Sorry, crazy day at work. We'll call this weekend. That weekend never came. 2 days later, I developed what I thought was a bad cold. By the end of the week, I was running a fever and could barely get out of bed. My neighbor, Mrs. Chen, found me collapsed in my garden where I'd been trying to water the tomatoes I'd planted for the grandchildren. Tomatoes they'd never asked for and would never eat. Mrs. Chen drove me to the emergency room where they diagnosed me with pneumonia. Pneumonia, at my age, alone, with no family listed as emergency contacts because I'd been too embarrassed to put down Kyle's number after the last time he'd seemed annoyed to be bothered with my minor health issues. I spent 4 days in the hospital, 4 days of nurses asking, "Isn't there someone we can call? Family member? Anyone?" And me saying, "No, they're very busy people." Kyle found out I'd been hospitalized when Mrs. Chen finally called him on the 3rd day. He visited once for 20 minutes, checking his phone the entire time. "Why didn't you call me?" he asked, but his tone suggested inconvenience rather than concern. "I didn't want to bother you," I said, and the words tasted bitter in my mouth. Melissa never came at all. When I asked Kyle about it, he said, "She's dealing with Ben's tournament schedule. You know how crazy these soccer weekends get." I was released on a Thursday with instructions to rest and follow up with my primary care doctor. I took a taxi home, $47 I couldn't afford, because Kyle had a client presentation that couldn't be rescheduled. I unlocked my front door to find mail piled up, newspapers yellowing on the porch, and a house that felt like a tomb. That night, as I sat in my empty living room taking antibiotics and drinking lukewarm soup from a can, my phone rang. It was Melissa. "Margaret, I need to ask you a favor," she said without any preamble about my health or recovery. "Ben's tournament team made it to state championships. We need to travel to Sacramento next weekend, and we need money for hotels and gas. Can you transfer $800 to our account?" I held the phone away from my ear, staring at it like it was a foreign object. I'd just spent 4 days in the hospital, afraid and alone, and her first communication with me was a request for money. "Melissa," I said slowly, "I just got out of the hospital. I had pneumonia. I know. Kyle mentioned that. But this is really important for Ben's future. These scouts could change everything for him. Important for Ben's future. Nothing about whether I was okay. Nothing about whether I needed help with groceries or medication pickup or just someone to check on me. I don't have $800 right now," I said. "The hospital bills. Can't you put it on a credit card? This is your grandson we're talking about. Your grandson." As if my love for Ben could be measured by my willingness to go into debt for his soccer tournament while I was recovering from a serious illness. I hung up without answering, and they didn't call back to check on me. The microaggressions became a daily assault after that. When I called to ask if someone could drive me to my follow-up appointment, I still felt weak and dizzy. Kyle sighed heavily into the phone. "Mom, can't you take an Uber? Melissa has that thing at Emma's school, and I have back-to-back meetings." An Uber. For a 72-year-old woman recovering from pneumonia who'd never used a rideshare app in her life and was scared of getting into cars with strangers. When I finally made it to the doctor's office via taxi, another $35 I couldn't afford, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. My insurance had been showing irregular payment patterns, and my pharmacy benefits had been flagged for suspicious activity. "It looks like someone has been using your insurance card for prescriptions not prescribed to you," the billing clerk explained. "Blood pressure medications, anxiety medications, things not on your current prescription list." I stared at the papers she handed me, seeing Kyle's name and Melissa's name on pharmacy records I'd never authorized. They'd been using my Medicare information to fill their prescriptions, saving money on their own health care by fraudulently using mine. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. Not only had they taken my house, my money, my peace of mind, they'd been stealing my medical benefits. Benefits I'd earned through 40 years of teaching. 40 years of paying into a system that was supposed to protect me in my old age. That evening, I sat in my kitchen with the insurance documents spread out in front of me like evidence at a crime scene. I called the pharmacy to verify what I already knew. 13 prescriptions filled under my name and insurance number in the past 8 months. Medications I'd never heard of, for conditions I didn't have. When I confronted Kyle about it, his response was even more devastating than the theft itself. "Mom, you're being paranoid. Those must be clerical errors. Why would you even assume we'd do something like that?" Paranoid. Gaslighting me for discovering their fraud. Making me question my own perception of reality. "Kyle, I have the pharmacy records right here. Your name is on these bottles. Look, maybe there was some mix-up when we picked up your prescriptions that one time. You're making this into something bigger than it is." That phrase again. Making this into something bigger than it is. As if prescription fraud was a small misunderstanding. As if my concerns about being stolen from were unreasonable. "Are you going to keep harassing us about every little thing?" Melissa's voice came from the background, loud enough for me to hear clearly. "Some people just look for reasons to be upset." I hung up and sat in the silence of my own kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of my family's betrayal, finally understanding that I wasn't losing my mind. I wasn't being dramatic. I wasn't being paranoid. I was being systematically robbed and emotionally abused by the people I loved most in the world. The next morning, I walked to my mailbox and found a notice from the county assessor's office. My property taxes were 3 months overdue. Taxes that Kyle had promised to handle as part of his taking care of everything arrangement. The penalty fees alone were more than $600. I called Kyle immediately. "Oh, that," he said dismissively. "Yeah, we've been meaning to take care of that. Can you just handle it for now? We'll reimburse you." Reimburse me. With what money? They hadn't made a mortgage payment in 8 months. They'd been using my insurance fraudulently. They'd abandoned me during a medical emergency to ask for soccer tournament money. "Kyle, I can't keep doing this," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm drowning financially. I'm alone. I'm sick. And you're treating me like an ATM that occasionally makes inconvenient noises." "Mom, you're being dramatic again. We're family. This is what family does for each other." "What does family do for each other, Kyle? Because I've been wondering what you've done for me lately." The line went quiet for a long moment. "We let you live in the house," he said finally. "Let me live in the house. The house I was paying for. The house that was in my name. The house I'd bought with my life insurance money and my husband's car and my financial security. They were letting me live there." That night, I stood in my bathroom looking at myself in the mirror. Really looking, maybe for the first time in years. I saw a woman who'd been erased from her own life, made invisible in her own home, reduced to a source of funding for people who saw her as a burden rather than a blessing. I saw a woman who'd forgotten she had choices. As I brushed my teeth with hands that were finally steady, I made a decision that would change everything. I was done being their victim. I was done being grateful for crumbs from a table I'd paid for. Tomorrow, I was going to stop the mortgage payments. And if that was drama, then they were about to get the performance of a lifetime. I called the bank on a Tuesday morning, my hands shaking as I dialed the number I'd memorized from years of making payments. The customer service representative, a young man named David, was polite and efficient as I explained that I could no longer afford the mortgage payments on the property. "Mrs. Morrison, I see here that you've been making payments consistently for 7 years. Are you experiencing a temporary financial hardship? Or is this a permanent change in your circumstances?" "Permanent," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "I have no family support, and I can no longer sustain these payments on my pension." "I understand. We'll send you information about your options, including loan modification programs and foreclosure procedures. The first missed payment will trigger a 30-day notice." After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen drinking coffee from James's favorite mug, the one with World's Best Dad that Kyle had given him for Father's Day 20 years ago. The irony wasn't lost on me. 3 weeks later, the first call came. Kyle's voice was tight, almost panicked. "Mom, the bank called me. Did you forget to make the payment?" I took a deep breath, feeling calmer than I had in months. "No, Kyle. I didn't forget." The silence on the other end stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. "What do you mean you didn't forget? Mom, what's going on?" "I mean, I can no longer afford to pay the mortgage on a house where I'm treated like an unwelcome guest. I'm done." "You're done? Mom, what are you talking about? This is our house. Our house. Not my house, which it legally was. Not the house I'd sacrificed everything to buy. Our house, as if he'd contributed anything beyond occupancy and complaints. Kyle, I haven't been able to afford groceries for the past 2 months because every penny of my pension goes to keeping you housed. When I was in the hospital with pneumonia, no one visited. When I asked for help getting to doctor appointments, I was told to take an Uber. But when you needed $800 for Ben's soccer tournament, that was urgent. Mom, you're blowing this out of proportion. We've been busy, but that doesn't mean we don't care about you. When was the last time you asked how I was doing? When was the last time you invited me to a family dinner instead of treating Sunday visits like a chore you had to endure? I could hear him breathing heavily into the phone. And then Melissa's voice in the background. Is she having some kind of breakdown? A breakdown. That's what they called it when someone finally stood up for themselves. Kyle came back to the phone. Look, Mom, maybe we haven't been as attentive as we should be, but you can't just stop paying the mortgage. We have children. We have responsibilities. And I have responsibility to myself, I said quietly. Something I forgot for 7 years. The call ended with Kyle promising to figure something out and come see me the next day. But it was Melissa who showed up first, bursting through my front door without knocking like she owned the place. Margaret, what the hell do you think you're doing? She demanded, her perfectly made-up face flushed with anger. Do you have any idea what you're putting us through? Ben and Emma are asking why Mommy and Daddy are fighting all the time. I looked at this woman who'd lived in luxury for 7 years on my dime, who'd excluded me from family gatherings while taking my money, who'd used my medical insurance fraudulently, and I felt something cold and hard settle in my chest. I'm putting you through something? I asked. Melissa, I've spent over $200,000 keeping this family housed and fed. I've missed meals so you could take vacations. I've gone without medication so Emma could have dance lessons. And when I was hospitalized, your first concern was whether I could send money for a soccer tournament. That's not fair, she shot back. We never asked you to starve yourself. You chose to help us because that's what grandmothers do. What grandmothers do? When was the last time you let me actually be a grandmother? When did you last invite me to spend time with my grandchildren that didn't involve you needing something from me? Melissa's face twisted with frustration. You're being vindictive, Margaret. This is exactly the kind of drama we were trying to avoid. We have been nothing but grateful for your help. Grateful? You replaced all my family photos with your own. You changed the locks so my key doesn't work. You use my medical insurance without permission. If that's gratitude, I'd hate to see what resentment looks like. Those prescriptions were a misunderstanding, and we changed the locks for security reasons. Whose security, Melissa? Because I sure don't feel secure in my own home. She stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her calculating, trying to figure out what approach would work on me now that guilt and manipulation were failing. "Look," she said, her voice suddenly softer, more conciliatory. "Maybe we have been taking you for granted, but you can't just destroy our lives because your feelings are hurt. Think about Ben and Emma. Think about their stability, built entirely on my financial instability. I am thinking about them," I said. "I'm thinking about what kind of lesson we're teaching them when they see their parents treat their grandmother like an ATM. I'm thinking about what they're learning about respect and family values." "You're being ridiculous," Melissa snapped, her facade of sweetness cracking. "We owe you nothing, Margaret. You offered to help us, remember? Nobody forced you." There it was. The truth she'd been hiding behind fake smiles and manufactured emergencies for 7 years. They owed me nothing. 7 years of sacrifice, and I was owed nothing in return. "You're right," I said calmly. "Nobody forced me, and nobody's forcing me to continue." Kyle arrived that evening with Ben and Emma in tow, clearly hoping their presence would guilt me into compliance. The children looked uncomfortable, probably coached on what to say to manipulate their grandmother's emotions. "Grandma Margaret," Emma said with rehearsed sadness, "Daddy says we might have to move. Are you really going to make us homeless?" I knelt down to Emma's level, looking into her sweet face that reminded me so much of Kyle at that age. "Sweetheart, nobody's going to be homeless. Your parents are both smart, capable adults who can take care of their family. But Daddy says you're the only one who can help us," Ben added, his voice uncertain. "Your daddy is wrong about that, honey. There are lots of ways to solve problems that don't involve making one person carry all the weight." Kyle stepped forward, his jaw tight with anger. "Mom, you're confusing the kids. Can we talk privately?" We went into the kitchen, leaving the children in the living room with their tablets. Kyle closed the door and turned to face me with an expression I'd never seen before. Cold, calculating, desperate. "What's it going to take?" he asked. "What do you want from us?" "I want nothing from you," I said. "That's the point. That's not an answer. You want us to visit more? Done. You want us to include you in family events? Fine. You want us to pay you back? We can work out a payment plan, but you cannot destroy our lives over hurt feelings." Hurt feelings. 7 years of financial abuse, emotional neglect, and outright theft reduced to hurt feelings. "Kyle, do you hear yourself? You're negotiating with me like I'm holding you hostage. You're offering to include me in my own family like it's a generous concession. You're treating basic respect like a bargaining chip. I'm trying to find a solution that works for everyone." "No, you're trying to find a way to keep taking from me without giving anything back. You're trying to figure out the minimum amount of fake affection you can offer to keep your personal ATM operational." His face flushed red. "That's not fair, Mom. We love you." "When? When do you love me? When you need something from me? Because that's the only time I hear from any of you." "You're being impossible," he said, his voice rising. "We can't turn back time and fix every mistake we've made. But we can move forward if you'll stop being so stubborn about this." Stubborn. Standing up for myself after 7 years of abuse was stubborn. "Kyle," I said quietly, "answer me one question honestly. If I had no money, if I had nothing to offer you financially, would you still want me in your life?" He opened his mouth to answer, then closed it. The silence stretched between us, heavy with truth we both recognized. "That's what I thought," I said. As they left that night, without hugs, without apologies, without any acknowledgement of the pain they'd caused, I heard Kyle on the phone in the driveway, his voice carrying through my open window. "She's lost her mind," he was saying to someone. "We're going to have to look into legal options. Maybe talk to someone about her mental state." Mental state. Now that their free ride was ending, they were going to question my sanity. I closed the window and drew the curtains, shutting out the sound of their voices. For the first time in 7 years, I felt something approaching peace. The storm was just beginning, but I was no longer afraid of it. I was ready to weather whatever came next, because I finally remembered who I used to be before I became their victim. The morning after Kyle's threat about legal options, I woke up before dawn with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. I made myself coffee. Real coffee, not the instant stuff I'd been buying to save money. and sat in James's chair watching the sunrise paint my kitchen windows gold. For the first time in 7 years, I wasn't calculating how much each sip cost, or worrying about whether I could afford groceries this week. I was free. The mortgage payment I wouldn't be making this month represented $3,200 that could stay in my account. Money for food that wasn't on clearance. Money for medications without rationing pills. Money for the small luxuries that made life worth living instead of just surviving. I spent that first morning doing something I hadn't done in years. I went grocery shopping without a calculator. Walking through the aisles of Safeway, I filled my cart with things I actually wanted to eat. Fresh salmon instead of canned tuna. Real butter instead of margarine. The good coffee beans instead of whatever was on sale. Strawberries in November, because I wanted them, and I could afford them. At the checkout counter, the total came to $127.43. 3 months ago, that would have sent me into a panic. Today, I handed over my debit card without fear, without that sick feeling in my stomach that came from watching my account balance shrink toward zero. The young cashier, a girl about Emma's age with purple highlights in her hair, smiled at me as she handed me my receipt. "Have a great day, ma'am." "You too, honey," I said, and meant it. I was going to have a great day, maybe the first one in years. That afternoon, I did something else I hadn't done in forever. I called my old friend Ruth, who'd been my teaching colleague for 15 years before we both retired. We'd lost touch gradually, the way friendships sometimes do when life gets complicated and you're too exhausted to maintain connections that used to come naturally. "Margaret! Oh my goodness, is that really you?" Ruth's voice was warm with genuine pleasure. "I was just thinking about you last week. How are you, honey?" For a moment, I didn't know how to answer. How was I? For 7 years, the answer had been tired, or worried, or fine, when I wasn't fine at all. Today, the answer was different. "I'm better than I've been in a long time," I said honestly. "Ruth, I know this might sound strange, but would you like to have lunch sometime this week? I feel like I've been hiding from the world, and I'm ready to rejoin it." "I would love that. There's this new cafe downtown that serves the most amazing quiche. Are you free Thursday?" Thursday. I tried to remember the last time I'd made social plans that weren't centered around my family's needs. I couldn't. "Thursday sounds perfect," I said. After we hung up, I sat in my living room, really looked at it for the first time in months. The furniture was arranged entirely for Kyle and Melissa's convenience, with the sofa facing the expensive television they'd installed, artwork they'd chosen hanging on walls I was paying for. Even in my own home, I'd been edited out of the picture. I spent the rest of the afternoon rearranging everything the way I wanted it. I moved James's reading chair back to the window where he used to sit with his morning paper. I rehung the family photos that had been banished to my bedroom, pictures of Kyle as a child, photos of James and me through 40 years of marriage, snapshots of holidays when we were actually happy. I found a box in my closet that I hadn't opened in years. James's books, classic literature, history, biographies of people who'd changed the world through persistence and courage. I'd packed them away when Melissa complained they made the shelves look cluttered and old-fashioned. Now I displayed them prominently, remembering how James used to read passages aloud to me, how we'd discuss ideas and dreams and possibilities over dinner. When had I stopped having dreams? When had I started believing that my purpose was simply to make other people's dreams possible? That evening, my phone rang. Kyle's name appeared on the screen, and for the first time in years, I let it go to voicemail. I wasn't ready to hear whatever new manipulation or threat he'd prepared. I was protecting my peace of mind, something I'd forgotten I had the right to do. The voicemail was predictably dramatic. "Mom, I know you're there. We need to talk about this situation before it gets completely out of hand. Melissa thinks we should involve a mediator, maybe someone who can help us all communicate better. Call me back." A mediator. As if this were a dispute between equals rather than a pattern of financial abuse that had lasted 7 years. As if I needed professional help to communicate that I was tired of being treated like an ATM with inconvenient feelings. I deleted the message and made myself dinner. Grilled salmon with asparagus and a glass of wine. Good wine, not the cooking wine I'd been buying to save money. I set the table with my grandmother's china, lit candles, and ate slowly, savoring every bite. This was what dinner could be when you weren't stressed about money, when you weren't calculating the cost of every ingredient, when you weren't rushing to clean up before ungrateful family members arrived to use your home like a restaurant they never had to pay for. Over the next few days, I established new routines that centered my own needs instead of everyone else's emergencies. I woke up when my body was ready instead of when my anxiety demanded. I read books for pleasure instead of scanning financial documents and bank statements. I took long baths with expensive bath salts I'd bought myself as a gift. I also did something practical. I made an appointment with an attorney. Sandra Wheeler had been recommended by Mrs. Chen, my neighbor who'd become an unexpected ally throughout this ordeal. Sandra specialized in elder law and financial abuse cases, which I was finally ready to acknowledge described my situation. Her office was in a converted Victorian house downtown, warm and comfortable rather than intimidatingly corporate. Sandra herself was a woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd seen too many families destroy themselves over money and power. "Tell me about your situation, Margaret," she said, offering me tea and settling into her chair with the patience of someone who knew these stories took time to tell properly. I started with the mortgage arrangement 7 years ago and continued through the medical insurance fraud, the property tax deception, the systematic exclusion from family events while my financial support was still demanded. Sandra took notes without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions that helped me see the legal implications of what I'd experienced. "Margaret, what you're describing is financial elder abuse," she said when I finished. "It's unfortunately common, and it's often perpetrated by family members who gradually normalize the exploitation until the victim doesn't recognize it as abuse." Victim. The word should have stung, but instead it felt validating. I was a victim, which meant I wasn't responsible for what had happened to me. It meant I hadn't imagined or exaggerated the mistreatment. "The good news is that you still have legal recourse," Sandra continued. "The house is in your name, which means you have complete control over it, regardless of who's been making the payments. You can sell it, rent it, or continue living in it while they find alternative housing." "What about their claim that I'm mentally incompetent? Kyle mentioned looking into legal options." Sandra smiled grimly. "That's a common thread in these situations. For them to challenge your mental capacity, they'd need to prove you're unable to make rational decisions about your own finances. Given that you've just made the very rational decision to stop funding their lifestyle while neglecting your own needs, I think we'd have a strong defense." For the first time in months, I laughed. Really laughed, from deep in my belly, at the absurdity of being called crazy for finally acting sane. "There's something else you should know," Sandra added. "If you decide to pursue the insurance fraud issue, that's a criminal matter. Medicare fraud is a federal crime with serious consequences." I considered this. Did I want to send my son to prison? 6 months ago, the thought would have horrified me. Today, I felt only a cold satisfaction at knowing I had that option if his threats escalated. "I want to keep that in reserve," I said, "but I want them out of my house. We can start the eviction process immediately. Since there's no rental agreement and no payment being made, it's actually quite straightforward. 30 days' notice should be sufficient." That night, I sat at my kitchen table writing the eviction notice in my own handwriting. Not typed, not formal legal language, just my words to my son explaining that his tenancy in my house was terminated. "Dear Kyle and Melissa," I wrote, "you have 30 days to find alternative housing and vacate the premises. This decision is final and non-negotiable. You may contact me through my attorney if you have legal questions, but I will no longer discuss this matter directly with you. Margaret Morrison." I included Sandra's business card and sealed the envelope with a sense of finality that felt like closing a book on a chapter of my life I was ready to finish. The next morning, I drove to their house, my house, and slipped the notice under the front door. I didn't knock. I didn't wait to see their reaction. I simply delivered the message and drove away, feeling lighter with every mile I put between myself and that place. That evening, I had dinner with Ruth at the cafe she'd recommended. We talked about our grandchildren, our health, our plans for the future. Normal conversation between friends who cared about each other's well-being, without keeping score of who owed what to whom. "You seem different," Ruth observed as we shared a piece of chocolate cake for dessert. "More like your old self, but stronger somehow." I feel like I'm waking up from a very long, very bad dream, I told her. Like I'm remembering who I used to be before I forgot I had choices. What changed? She asked gently. I realized that being needed and being loved aren't the same thing, I said. And I decided I'd rather be alone than lonely in my own family. Ruth reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Good for you, Margaret. It's about time. As I drove home through the quiet Portland streets, past houses where families were probably sitting down to dinner together, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Contentment. Not happiness exactly, that would come later, but a deep, settled sense that I was finally headed in the right direction. For the first time in 7 years, I was living my own life instead of funding someone else's. The explosion came exactly 18 hours after I delivered the eviction notice. My phone started ringing at 6:47 a.m. Kyle's name flashed on the screen again and again, but I was having my morning coffee in peace, watching cardinals at the bird feeder I'd hung outside my kitchen window the day before. I'd forgotten how beautiful mornings could be when you weren't immediately assaulted by other people's crises and demands. After the 7th call, I turned my phone off entirely. By 9 a.m., they were pounding on my front door. "Mom, open this door right now!" Kyle's voice carried through the wood with a fury I hadn't heard since he was a teenager throwing tantrums about curfew and consequences. I finished my second cup of coffee, put on my favorite cardigan, the blue one with pearl buttons, and opened the door with the chain still attached. Kyle's face was red with rage, veins bulging in his neck. Melissa stood behind him, her arms crossed, looking like she wanted to physically attack me. Behind them, I could see Ben and Emma sitting in their car, probably told to wait while their parents handled their unreasonable grandmother. "What the hell is this?" Kyle demanded, waving my handwritten note in the air. "Are you having some kind of psychotic break?" "Good morning, Kyle," I said calmly. "I see you received my notice." "Notice? This is insane. You can't evict us from our own home." "It's not your home," I said, surprised by how steady my voice remained. "It's my home. My name is on the deed. My credit secured the loan. My money has been making the payments. For 7 years, we've been building equity in this house," Melissa shouted. "You can't just steal that from us." I almost laughed. "Equity? Melissa, you haven't made a mortgage payment in 8 months. You've built no equity. You've contributed nothing but wear and tear to a property I'm paying for. You offered to help us." Kyle's voice cracked with desperation. "You said it was temporary." "I said a lot of things 7 years ago when I still believed you loved me more than you needed my money. I was wrong. We do love you, Mom, but you're being completely unreasonable. Families don't treat each other this way." "You're absolutely right," I said. "Families don't treat each other this way. They don't steal medical insurance. They don't abandon each other in hospitals. They don't exclude grandmothers from holidays while demanding money for soccer tournaments." Melissa stepped forward, her face twisted with an anger that revealed who she really was beneath the fake politeness. "You bitter old woman. You're just jealous that we have a life and you don't. You're trying to destroy our family because yours is dead." The words hit like a slap, designed to wound, to make me doubt myself, to send me crawling back to my role as their victim. 6 months ago, they would have worked. Today, they bounced off me like rain off a windshield. My family isn't dead, Melissa. I'm very much alive, and I'm finally choosing to act like it. "We'll fight this," Kyle said, his voice dropping to a threatening growl. "We'll get lawyers. We'll prove you're not mentally competent. We'll show everyone how you're destroying your own grandchildren's lives out of spite." "Actually," I said, reaching into my cardigan pocket, "you'll be dealing with my lawyer." I handed Sandra Wheeler's business card through the gap in the door. "All future communication goes through her." Kyle stared at the card like it was a poisonous snake. "A lawyer? You hired a lawyer against your own family?" "I hired a lawyer to protect myself from people who were taking advantage of me. The fact that those people happen to be related to me is unfortunate, but irrelevant." "You don't understand," Melissa said, her voice suddenly shifting to pleading desperation. "We can't afford to move. We have no savings. Our credit is still ruined. You're making us homeless. You're both educated adults with good jobs. I'm confident you'll figure something out. People do it every day." "What about the kids?" Kyle demanded. "What about Ben and Emma? Are you really going to uproot them from their schools, their friends, their stability? I looked past them to the car where my grandchildren sat staring at their phones, probably more interested in their games than in this adult drama playing out on my front porch. Kyle, those children have been living in a house where their parents taught them that love is conditional on financial support, where they learned that grandmothers exist to be used and discarded, where they watched you treat me like an ATM for 7 years. Maybe learning that actions have consequences will be the most valuable education they've ever received. You're insane, Melissa spat. This is all because we forgot your birthday and didn't visit you enough in the hospital. You're destroying lives over hurt feelings. There it was again. Hurt feelings. As if 7 years of financial abuse, emotional neglect, and systematic exploitation were equivalent to having your feelings bruised at a dinner party. No, Melissa. This is because you forgot I was a human being. Because you forgot I had needs and limits and rights. Because you forgot that respect and love can't be purchased, they have to be earned. Kyle pulled out his phone and started dialing. I'm calling Adult Protective Services. This is clearly elder abuse. You being manipulated by some lawyer into making decisions against your own best interests. Go ahead, I said. When they arrive, I'll show them the evidence of medical insurance fraud, the documentation of financial exploitation, and the pharmacy records proving you've been stealing my Medicare benefits. I'm sure they'll be very interested in who's actually being abused here. Kyle's finger stopped mid-dial. He and Melissa exchanged a look that confirmed what I already knew. They understood exactly how much legal trouble they could be in if I decided to pursue criminal charges. Look, Kyle said, his voice suddenly conciliatory, maybe we can work something out. A payment plan for what we owe you, a schedule for more regular visits. We could even give you power of attorney over our finances, so you know we're managing money responsibly. Power of attorney over their finances. The audacity was breathtaking. They'd stolen from me for years, and now they were offering to let me manage their money as if that were some kind of generous concession. Kyle, there is nothing you can offer me that I want from you anymore. No payment plan, no visiting schedule, no legal arrangements. I want my house back, and I want you out of my life until you can treat me with basic human dignity. So that's it? He asked, his voice cracking. You're just done with us? For a moment, I saw my little boy again, the child who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, who brought me dandelions and called them flowers, who told me I was the best mommy in the world. The grief of losing that child. Of watching him become this man who saw me as nothing more than a resource to exploit, almost broke my resolve. Almost. I'm done being your victim, I said quietly. If you ever decide you want a relationship based on love and respect instead of financial convenience, you know where to find me. But I will never again pay for the privilege of being treated like garbage by people who are supposed to love me. Fine, Melissa said, grabbing Kyle's arm. We don't need this. We don't need her. Come on, Kyle. Let's go tell the kids their grandmother doesn't want them anymore. That was her final manipulation attempt. Trying to make me responsible for her explanation to the children. Trying to make me the villain in a story where I was actually the victim finding her voice. Tell them whatever you want, Melissa. Tell them I'm crazy. Tell them I'm mean. Tell them I don't love them. But maybe someday, when they're adults, they'll understand that love isn't supposed to cost everything you have to give. As they walked back to their car, Kyle turned around one last time. I hope you're happy, he called out. I hope being right is worth losing your family. I'm not losing my family, I called back. I'm finding myself. I watched them drive away, probably heading to Melissa's parents' house where they'd be welcomed with open arms and no expectations of financial contribution. The car disappeared around the corner, taking with it 7 years of stress, manipulation, and financial abuse. I closed the door, locked it, and put the chain back in place. Then I walked to my kitchen and made myself a cup of tea using the good china, James's favorite cup that I'd been saving for special occasions. Today felt like a special occasion. Today I'd chosen myself over people who'd forgotten I mattered. My phone, when I finally turned it back on, showed 17 missed calls and 12 text messages. I deleted all of them without reading them and blocked Kyle's and Melissa's numbers. Whatever they had to say could go through Sandra Wheeler now. That evening, I called Ben's cell phone, the one I'd been paying for as part of their family plan. He answered on the second ring. "Grandma, Mom and Dad said you don't want to see us anymore." "That's not true, sweetheart," I said gently. "I love you and Emma very much. But I can't have a relationship with your parents right now because they've been treating me very poorly. When you turn 18, if you want to have a relationship with me, I'll be here." "Are you really making us move?" "Ben, that house belongs to me. I've been paying for it while your parents lived there for free. Now I need to take care of myself." There was a long pause. "Mom and Dad are really mad. They're saying mean things about you." "I'm sorry you have to hear that, honey. But sometimes adults have to make difficult decisions to protect themselves. I don't really understand all this grown-up stuff," he said quietly. "But I miss you, Grandma. I miss you too, baby. More than you know." After we hung up, I sat in James's chair watching the sunset paint my living room walls gold and pink. I thought about the years ahead. Years without birthday parties for grandchildren who barely acknowledged my presence. Years without expensive Christmas gifts for people who'd forgotten to say thank you. Years without draining my bank account to fund someone else's lifestyle. Years of peace. Years of financial stability. Years of remembering who I was before I became someone else's solution to every problem. For the first time in 7 years, the future looked bright. 3 weeks after the confrontation, I did something I hadn't done in over 20 years. I booked a vacation. Not a family trip where I'd pay for everyone's meals and accommodate everyone else's preferences. Not a brief weekend getaway, squeezed between other people's obligations. A real vacation, planned entirely around what I wanted to see and do, funded by the money I was no longer pouring into other people's lives. I chose the Oregon coast, a 2-week stay in a bed and breakfast in Cannon Beach where James and I had honeymooned 48 years ago. Back then, we'd been young and broke, staying in a cheap motel and eating packed sandwiches on the beach. This time, I was staying in a Victorian inn with an ocean view, and I was going to eat lobster whenever I wanted it. The morning I left, I stood in my reclaimed living room with my suitcase by the door, looking around at the space that finally felt like mine again. James's books were back on their shelves. My grandmother's doilies were displayed on the tables. The walls held photos of people who actually loved me instead of artwork chosen by people who'd erased me from my own home. I'd painted the kitchen yellow while Kyle and Melissa were scrambling to find new housing. Bright, cheerful yellow that made every morning feel like sunshine. I'd bought new curtains for the windows, soft blue ones that James would have loved. I'd planted a small herb garden in the backyard where I could grow basil and rosemary for the meals I was finally cooking for someone who appreciated them. Myself. The house felt bigger with just me in it, but it was a good kind of bigger. Room to breathe. Room to think. Room to remember who I'd been before I'd shrunk myself down to fit into other people's convenience. The drive to the coast took me through familiar territory, but everything looked different now. The mountains seemed more majestic, the forests more lush, the small towns more charming. It was as if I'd been looking at the world through a gray filter for 7 years, and someone had finally removed it. At the inn, a lovely woman named Catherine showed me to my room. A cozy space with white lace curtains, a window seat overlooking the ocean, and a fireplace I could use whenever I wanted. The luxury of it almost brought me to tears. Not because I couldn't afford it. I could easily, now that I wasn't supporting 4 other people, but because it had been so long since I'd done anything purely for my own pleasure. "The dining room serves breakfast until 10, Catherine explained, "and we have tea service every afternoon at 4. Most of our guests love to walk the beach in the mornings when the light is best for photography." Photography. I hadn't taken pictures in years, not since Kyle and Melissa had made it clear that my constant photo-taking at family events was embarrassing and old-fashioned. I'd put away my camera, along with so many other parts of myself that they'd found inconvenient. That afternoon, I walked into town and bought a new digital camera, a good one, with lenses for different types of shots. The young man at the camera shop spent an hour teaching me the features, and his enthusiasm reminded me why I'd loved photography in the first place. The way light could transform an ordinary moment into something magical, the satisfaction of capturing beauty that might otherwise be forgotten. My first week at the coast was a revelation. I woke up when my body was ready, not when someone else needed something from me. I ate what I wanted, when I wanted it. I read entire books without interruption. I took long baths in the clawfoot tub while listening to rain on the window. And I remembered things about myself that I'd forgotten. I remembered that I loved jazz music, something I'd stopped playing when Melissa complained it was depressing old people music. I remembered that I enjoyed cooking elaborate meals, not just efficient ones designed to feed ungrateful people as cheaply as possible. I remembered that I was actually quite funny when I wasn't walking on eggshells, afraid that my personality might be judged inconvenient. One morning, I was sitting on the beach taking pictures of the sunrise when an elderly man approached with his golden retriever. "Beautiful morning," he said, settling onto the driftwood log beside me. "I'm Frank. This is Buster. We come here every morning to watch the world wake up." "I'm Margaret," I said, scratching Buster behind the ears. "And this is the most peaceful place I've ever been." Frank was a widower, I learned, who'd moved to the coast 5 years earlier after his wife passed away. "Our kids thought I was crazy," he told me with a smile. "They wanted me to move closer to them in California, be available for constant babysitting and yard work. But I realized I'd spent my whole marriage taking care of other people. After Martha died, I decided it was time to take care of myself." We talked for an hour about books, travel, the surprising freedom that came with putting your own needs first. Frank had learned to oil paint since moving to the coast. He'd taken cooking classes. He'd joined a hiking group for seniors and was planning a trip to Ireland. "The funny thing is," he said as we prepared to part ways, "my kids visit more often now than when I was bending over backwards to accommodate them. Respect yourself, and other people respect you too." That evening I called Ruth. "Margaret, how's your vacation?" "Ruth, I think I'm having the time of my life," I said, surprising myself with the truth of it. "I'm remembering who I used to be, and I like her." "Tell me everything," Ruth said. And for the next hour, I did. I told her about my morning beach walks, about the photography class I'd signed up for, about the seafood restaurant where I'd ordered the most expensive item on the menu just because I could. "You sound like a completely different person," Ruth observed. "Lighter somehow. I feel like I've been carrying a 100-pound backpack for 7 years, and I finally got permission to put it down. What's next for you? After the vacation, I mean." I'd been thinking about that. "I'm going to sell the house," I said, the decision crystallizing as I spoke. "It's too big for me and it has too many bad memories. I'm thinking about buying something smaller, maybe closer to the coast. Somewhere I can start fresh." "That sounds wonderful, Margaret. And scary." "It is scary," I admitted. "But it's the good kind of scary, the kind that comes with possibilities instead of dread." The second week of my vacation, I took day trips to small coastal towns, exploring galleries and bookshops and cafes. In each place, I bought myself something beautiful: a handmade pottery mug, a watercolor painting of the lighthouse, a book of poetry by a local author. Small treasures chosen purely because they brought me joy. I also did something I'd never done before. I joined a group. The inn offered guided bird-watching walks, and I signed up on impulse. The group was small, 6 women of various ages who met twice a week to explore different parts of the coast. "Have you done this before?" asked Sarah, a woman about my age with short silver hair and bright blue eyes. "Never," I admitted. "I'm trying a lot of new things lately." "Good for you," said Janet, another group member. "I started birdwatching after my divorce. Best decision I ever made." There's something about watching creatures who are completely free that reminds you freedom is possible. As we walked through the coastal forest that morning, binoculars around our necks, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: the simple pleasure of learning something new. We spotted herons and hawks, tiny wrens and magnificent bald eagles. Each sighting felt like a small miracle, a reminder that there was so much beauty in the world I'd been too stressed and exhausted to notice. "Look," whispered Sarah, pointing to a tree branch above us. A great blue heron. I raised my binoculars and found the magnificent bird, standing perfectly still, watching the water below with infinite patience. Something about its stillness, its confidence in its own purpose, spoke to me. "They're incredibly patient," Janet explained quietly. "They can stand motionless for hours, waiting for exactly the right moment to strike. No wasted energy, No unnecessary movement. They know their worth. They know their worth. The phrase stayed with me as we continued our walk, as we shared lunch at a small cafe overlooking the bay, as I drove back to the inn that afternoon. For 7 years, I'd forgotten my worth. I'd allowed other people to convince me that my value lay only in what I could provide for them. I'd become like a bird that had forgotten how to fly, spending all its time on the ground picking up scraps instead of soaring through the sky it was designed to inhabit. That evening, I sat in the window seat in my room, watching the sunset paint the ocean in shades of gold and pink. I thought about Frank and his decision to prioritize his own happiness. I thought about the patient heron, confident in its own purpose. I thought about the woman I'd been before I'd allowed fear and guilt to cage me. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found a number I hadn't called in 3 years. My old principal, Janet Morrison. No relation, despite the shared last name. Janet had tried to convince me to come back to substitute teaching after I retired, but I'd declined, claiming I was too busy with family obligations. Family obligations. Code 4. Too exhausted from being financially and emotionally drained to pursue anything that might bring me fulfillment. Janet, this is Margaret Morrison. I know it's been a long time, but I was wondering, do you still need substitute teachers? Margaret, what a wonderful surprise. Yes, we're always looking for reliable subs, especially someone with your experience. Are you interested in getting back into the classroom? I think I am, I said, smiling at my reflection in the window. I think I'm ready to remember what it feels like to be needed for the right reasons. We talked for 20 minutes about scheduling and requirements, about the joy of working with children who appreciated learning instead of adults who took everything for granted. When I hung up, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Excitement about the future. The last morning of my vacation, I woke up before dawn and walked to the beach one final time. The sunrise was spectacular, bands of orange and pink stretching across the horizon like a promise of new beginnings. I took dozens of photos, but more importantly, I stood there in the silence and made myself a promise. I would never again apologize for taking up space in my own life. I would never again pay for the privilege of being treated poorly. I would never again confuse being needed with being loved. As I packed my suitcase later that morning, I realized something that made me laugh out loud. I was looking forward to going home. Not because my vacation was over, but because home was finally a place I wanted to be. A place that belonged to me, filled with things I loved, organized around my own comfort and happiness. I was driving back to a life that was entirely my own. And for the first time in 7 years, that felt like the greatest gift I could give myself. 6 months later, I was standing in the kitchen of my new cottage in Seaside, Oregon, making coffee in my favorite mug and watching the morning light dance across the ocean through my window. The cottage was small, just 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, and an open living area that flowed into a galley kitchen, but every inch of it was mine. Every piece of furniture chosen because I loved it. Every color selected because it made me smile. Every decision made with only one person's happiness in mind. My own. The house in Portland had sold within 3 weeks of listing. The real estate market was strong, and the location was desirable. But I think potential buyers could sense something else about the property, that it was finally being sold by someone who was ready to let go, rather than someone clinging desperately to a life that no longer served them. Kyle and Melissa had found an apartment across town. I'd heard through Mrs. Chen, who'd become one of my closest friends, that they were struggling financially without my subsidies, that Kyle's business wasn't doing as well as he'd claimed, that they'd had to pull the children out of private school. Part of me felt a twinge of sadness for the disruption in my grandchildren's lives, but a larger part of me recognized that children are remarkably resilient and that learning to live within your actual means is a valuable life lesson. They hadn't contacted me since the eviction, which was exactly what I'd expected. Their love had always been conditional on my usefulness, so my absence from their lives was simply the natural consequence of my decision to stop being useful to them. But there had been one beautiful surprise. 3 weeks ago, my doorbell had rung on a Saturday morning. I'd opened it to find Ben standing on my porch, taller than I remembered, carrying a small backpack and wearing an uncertain smile. "Hi, Grandma. I took the bus. I hope that's okay." I'd pulled him into my arms and held him tight, breathing in the scent of the boy I'd missed more than I'd allowed myself to acknowledge. At 15, he was becoming a young man, but in my embrace, he was still my grandson who used to help me bake cookies and ask endless questions about everything. "It's more than okay, sweetheart. How did you find me?" "I looked you up online. Your address is public record. Mom and Dad don't know I'm here." We'd spent the day walking on the beach, talking about school and friends and his plans for the future. He told me about the tension at home, how his parents argued constantly about money now, how Melissa blamed me for all their problems while Kyle defended me in weak, half-hearted ways that fooled no one. "I don't really understand everything that happened," Ben had said, as we sat on a piece of driftwood, watching waves crash against the rocks. "But I know you're not the bad guy here. Mom and Dad are mad because they can't live in that big house anymore, but they never paid for it anyway, right?" "That's right, honey. So really, you were just stopping doing something nice for them, and they got mad at you for that." The clarity of youth. Ben understood in simple terms what his parents had spent months complicating with manipulation and blame. "I missed you, Grandma," he'd said quietly. "It's not the same without you around." "I missed you too, sweetheart. More than you know." Before he left that evening, I'd driven him to the bus station, worried about him traveling alone but respecting his independence. He'd hugged me tight and said something that still made my eyes well up with tears. "I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself. Mom says you abandoned us, but I think you just remembered you mattered too. You just remembered you mattered too." From the mouth of a 15-year-old, the most profound summary of my transformation I'd heard yet. Now, as I stood in my cottage kitchen preparing for another day of substitute teaching at Seaside Elementary, I thought about how dramatically my life had changed. Not just the external circumstances, the smaller house, the ocean view, the financial freedom, but the internal landscape of my daily existence. I woke up each morning with energy instead of dread. I went to bed each night with satisfaction instead of anxiety. I made decisions based on what felt right for me instead of what would prevent someone else from being disappointed in me. The teaching had been a revelation. Walking into classrooms full of bright-eyed children who were genuinely excited to learn, who appreciated every story I told and every lesson I shared, reminded me why I'd become an educator in the first place. These children saw me as a valuable resource, not because of my bank account, but because of my knowledge, experience, and care. "Mrs. Morrison, will you read us another story?" they'd ask, gathering around my chair with the kind of enthusiasm I'd forgotten was possible. "Mrs. Morrison, can you help me with this math problem?" they'd say, trusting that I wanted to help them succeed, rather than viewing my assistance as something they were entitled to receive. Working with children again had shown me the difference between being needed in healthy ways and being exploited in unhealthy ones. These students needed my knowledge and guidance, but they also gave back. Attention, appreciation, excitement about learning. It was a reciprocal relationship built on mutual respect, not a one-sided extraction of resources. In the afternoons, I often walked the beach with my camera, capturing the endless beauty of the Oregon coast. I'd joined the local photography club, where I'd met other people who shared my passion for finding beauty in everyday moments. We took weekend trips to photograph wildflowers and waterfalls, lighthouses and tide pools. Every outing was an adventure. Every new friendship a gift I'd given myself by choosing to prioritize my own happiness. Ruth visited once a month, marveling at my transformation each time she saw me. "You look 10 years younger," she'd say. And I felt it too. The chronic tension I'd carried in my shoulders for 7 years had melted away. The worry lines around my eyes had softened. I smiled more easily, laughed more freely, moved through the world with the confidence of someone who knew her own worth. My finances, freed from the constant drain of supporting 4 other people, had stabilized beautifully. The mortgage on my cottage was less than half what I'd been paying on Kyle's house. My monthly expenses had dropped dramatically without the constant requests for emergency funding, soccer tournament money, and loans that were never repaid. For the first time in years, I was actually saving money instead of watching my accounts drain away to fund other people's lifestyles. I'd opened a separate savings account that I privately called my Dignity Fund. Money set aside to ensure I'd never again be in a position where I had to choose between my self-respect and my financial security. Every month I added to it, watching the balance grow with a satisfaction that had nothing to do with greed and everything to do with independence. Some evenings I sat on my small deck with a glass of wine, watching the sunset paint the sky in impossible colors, and I thought about forgiveness, not for Kyle and Melissa. That would come eventually, or it wouldn't, and either outcome was acceptable, but for myself. Forgiveness for the years I'd spent believing that love was supposed to hurt, that sacrifice was supposed to leave you empty, that being needed meant being used. I forgave the woman who'd been so desperate to maintain family connections that she'd allowed herself to be systematically drained and discarded. I understood why she'd made those choices, even as I promised myself I'd never make them again. Last week, I'd received an unexpected phone call from Emma. She was 12 now, old enough to use the internet to find my number, old enough to understand that the family narrative she'd been fed might not be the complete truth. "Grandma Margaret? It's Emma." "Emma. Oh, sweetheart, how wonderful to hear your voice. I wanted to call you because I miss you, and because Ben told me he visited you and that you live by the ocean now." We'd talked for almost an hour. She told me about school, her friends, her frustration with her parents' constant financial stress. I told her about my cottage, my photography, the seals I'd seen during my morning beach walks. "Grandma, can I ask you something?" "Of course, honey. Are you happier now?" "Ben says you seem happier." "I am happier, sweetheart. Much happier." "Good," she'd said with the simple satisfaction of a child who wanted the adults she loved to be okay. "I'm glad you're happy." As I finished my coffee and prepared to leave for school, I looked around my cottage one more time, at the photos of friends and family who actually loved me, at the books I was reading for pleasure, at the fresh flowers I'd bought myself because they made me smile. This was what a life looked like when you stopped apologizing for taking up space in it. My phone buzzed with a text from Ruth. "Coffee this weekend? I want to hear about your latest photography adventure." "Absolutely," I texted back. "I have so much to tell you." I gathered my teaching materials, locked my door, and walked to my car with the kind of lightness in my step that comes from knowing you're heading towards something you enjoy rather than something you have to endure. 6 months ago, if someone had told me I'd be living alone by the ocean, working with children again, making new friends, and genuinely excited about my future, I would have thought they were describing someone else's life. The woman I'd been then couldn't have imagined the woman I'd become. Not because the transformation was impossible, but because she'd forgotten that transformation was allowed. But here's what I've learned, and what I want you to know if you're listening to this story and recognizing yourself in it. You don't have to earn love by emptying yourself into other people. You don't have to prove your worth by accepting crumbs from tables you've paid to set. You don't have to be grateful for being included in your own family at the cost of your dignity, your security, and your peace of mind. Love that requires you to diminish yourself isn't love. It's exploitation dressed up in family obligation. Respect that has to be purchased isn't respect. It's a transaction that will bankrupt your soul while enriching people who see you as nothing more than a resource to be mined. And here's the most important thing. It's never too late to choose yourself. It's never too late to remember that you matter, that your needs are valid, that your happiness is just as important as everyone else's. It's never too late to stop being someone else's solution and start being your own priority. The people who truly love you will respect your boundaries and celebrate your happiness. The people who don't, well, their absence will hurt initially, but it won't hurt as much as their presence did when it came with conditions and expectations that slowly killed your spirit. I'm 72 years old, and I've never been happier. I live in a house I love, work at a job that fulfills me, and spend my time with people who value me for who I am rather than what I can provide. I take pictures of sunsets because they're beautiful, not because someone else wants me to document their life. I cook meals I enjoy, buy clothes I like, and make plans based on my own desires rather than everyone else's demands. This is what freedom looks like. This is what happens when you finally stop paying the mortgage on other people's dreams and start investing in your own. Have you ever found yourself in a situation like mine? Have you ever felt like you were giving everything you had To people who treated your generosity like their right rather than your gift? Tell me about it in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, if it reminded you that you deserve better than being taken for granted, please like this video and subscribe to this channel. These stories need to be told, and these truths need to reach people who feel as lost and forgotten as I once did. Because you matter. Your happiness matters. And it's never too late to come home to yourself.